Welcome everyone to the Minda-Regensburg Center for European Studies. I'm Grzegorz Ekiert. I'm director of the center and professor of government here at Harvard. This is our second event in a series of events devoted to the Russian war on Ukraine and its consequences for Europe. This seminar is co-sponsored by our friends from Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and from Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Let me thank at the outset to our staff at Center for European Studies and especially to Kerry, Kale, and Michael for working on this seminar. Now, the brutal Russian aggression entered its 50th day today. And the resilience of Ukrainian nation and the heroism of Ukrainian army is beyond belief. So is the suffering. Millions of civilians were displaced, including a third of Ukrainian children. Cities are turned into ruins and war crimes were committed by the Russian army. It looks that this war has no quick ending. How long the West determination to help Ukraine to repel Russian aggression will last, how long Ukraine will be able to defend itself, what can persuade Putin to stop the war. These are the questions, and we have a great panel today to answer this and other questions. Let me briefly introduce our speakers. Angela Stent is director of the Center for Euro-Asian, Russian, and East European Studies and professor of government and foreign service at Georgetown University in Washington. She is also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, a member of the senior advisory panel for the NATO Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and a member of Council on Foreign Relations. From 2004 to 2006, she served as the National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. And before she served in the Office of Policy Planning at the US Department of State. Angela's highly acclaimed work focuses on political and economic relations between United States, Russia, and Europe. And you see behind her her book on Putin's world. Angela received degrees from Cambridge University, London School of Economics, and MA and PhD from our government department at Harvard University. Now, our second speaker is Radek Sikorski, who is the member of the European Parliament, where he serves as a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence, and the Subcommittee on Security and Defense. He also chairs the Delegation for Relations with the United States. He is a senior fellow at the Center for European Studies here at Harvard and distinguished statement at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Radek has served formerly as Poland's Minister of Defense from 2005 to 2007, Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2007 to 2014, and was the Marshal of the Polish Parliament. He graduated from University of Oxford in philosophy, politics, and economics. He was a war correspondent in Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion and is the author of several books. Now we'll begin with short opening statements from our panelists to be followed by question and answer. Now, please send the questions you have via Q&A function, and I will monitor those questions during our conversation and try to bring as many of the questions to our panelists as we possibly can. So Angela, please let me give you the floor.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this panel. So I thought what I would do is to recap briefly the four major miscalculations that Putin made in launching this brutal invasion of Ukraine, and see how they've affected the conduct of the war and where we are today. So obviously the first major miscalculation that Putin made was that the Ukrainians would surrender within 72 hours and would welcome their Russian liberators from Nazism and genocide. Ukrainian resistance has been fierce. It's been really impressive. It's been really amazing for us to watch. And it's repulsed, obviously, Russia's attempt to take Kiev. So far, the Russian military is now gone from Kiev. I think that resistance has grown stronger, even as all of these atrocities are discovered in Bucha, in other places near Kiev, and even as Mariupol has been almost bombed into submission. So I see no let up in that. I think the only message is that NATO has to keep supplying Ukraine with the wherewithal to fight back the Russians as we now enter what appears to be the second phase of this war, which is the desire to control the entire Donbas region. At least that's what Putin has said. The second major miscalculation, apparently on Putin's part, was that the Russian military would perform effectively. The Russian military has been extremely brutal in Ukraine, using similar tactics to what they used in Chechnya, in Syria, in other places, very brutal, but it's achieved few of Putin's objectives. Now we know that there's a new commander-in-chief who's apparently Dvornikov, who's supposed to be more effective, unite everyone in the strategy, but it remains to be seen. And I think not only was Putin mistaken about the Russian military, but I think the United States certainly was, and its intelligence agencies, I think they overestimated the ability of the Russian military to fight in this way, and they're recalibrating that now. The third miscalculation, of course, that Putin made was that the West wouldn't really respond effectively to what Russia did. So Putin looked back at what happened after the Russia-Georgia war in 2008, after the annexation of Crimea and the launch of the war in the Donbas. And yes, there were sanctions and there was condemnation. And for a while, relations were put on hold. But he probably didn't expect the kind of reaction, which of course has gotten stronger in the West as all of these atrocities are being revealed. And we've had a robust, unified Western political response. And at the moment, I think that's holding very firm. We're focused on Europe here, but I just note that it's also quite impressive that the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Singaporeans, that some major Asian partners and allies are also now part of this response, which they weren't in 2014. The fourth miscalculation that Putin made was that Europe would never agree to impose tough sanctions on Russia, that the Europeans were too dependent on the trade and wouldn't do that. And so Russia, I think, was shocked by how much transatlantic unity there's been on these very tough sanctions, financial sanctions, export controls, all of the other sanctions that have been imposed, the sanctions against oligarchs, individuals. But the only thing, of course, that hasn't happened yet, and where Putin probably also calculated, is that the Germans particularly, and some other European countries, have been unwilling to impose total sanctions on the import of Russian oil and gas. And there's obviously disagreement there. And so far, those billions are still rolling in to fill the Russian state coffers. So let me just end with one area where I think Putin didn't miscalculate. For the past at least 10 years, he's been cultivating very much relations with the non-democratic, non-Western world. And we see outside of the democratic world, with very few exceptions, no country has condemned the Russian invasion or has imposed sanctions. China, of course, being the most obvious country here. And without China, knowledge of China's support, I do not believe that Putin would have launched this war. But also we see India, which is after all a partner of the United States, an ally, Mexico, Brazil, much of the Middle East, South Africa, and much of Africa. And so what that really means is that these countries continue to pursue sort of normal relations with Russia, and that if and when this war is over, Russia will not, or Putin will not be a pariah leader in that part of the world, although he may be in the rest of the world. As of now, I think the Russians appear to be completely uninterested in any kind of negotiated settlement. I think the negotiations we've had so far have just been for show from the Russian point of view. I think the Ukrainians, or many of them, have been quite sincere about that. The determination now to take all of the Donbass, presumably to declare victory of some sort on May the 9th when they have their parade in Red Square. But also I think that this war could go on for a very long time. It won't necessarily be over even if they do take more territory in the Donbass. And so again, the final message is that the West has to try and remain united. And it's going to be difficult to do that as the impact of sanctions hits the West more, hits Europe, hits the United States in terms of prices and inflation and availability of gasoline and things like that. It's going to be tougher, but that unity has to remain. And then, those weapons have to still go to Ukraine. And the US has said, well, there's some more sophisticated weapons that the Ukrainians, don't know how to use that. So I think the message has to be start training them now because they may need to use this as the fight goes on. So I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Thank you, Angela. Let me turn the floor to Radek Sikorski.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the generous introduction. And I agree with almost every word of Angela's. So let me just give a slightly different angle on the same reality. And the way I look at it is that Putin's invasion is the last throw of the Russian Empire. Think of Ukraine as Russia's Algeria or Russia's Ireland. And of course, it's confused by the fact that Russia's empire has always been contiguous. But some of the psychological realities are very similar. The mother country denies the colony the very right to exist, let alone have a state. And it takes time and usually a war for the colonials to say, no, we really are different and we really want to separate. And it takes violence until the thought matures and until the metropolis lets loose. And I think we're at the beginning of that process. Some of those Russian propagandists are beginning to see and say that the Ukrainians have actually recreated their nation in the last 30 years. Secondly, the reason Russia is failing so far is Putinism. It is the widespread corruption, which is the best ally of the Ukrainian army. I spoke to our generals who told me, look, the T-80 tank with full tanks, including external tanks, has a range of 500-600 kilometers. But those tanks ran out of fuel outside Kharkiv, 30 kilometers into Ukrainian territory, because someone stole the fuel. And it is all-encompassing corruption which has made the Russian army what it is today, and also cronyism. Everybody tampered with the intelligence from Ukraine going up to Putin until Putin was getting a picture of Ukraine that was completely at odds with reality. And he made his decision on very faulty information. Now, I agree we will have at least one big battle before Putin negotiates in earnest. And I have the same question before this battle that I had before the invasion as a whole. Does Putin really have enough forces to win? He attacked Ukraine with a smaller number of troops than the standing Ukrainian army, let alone Ukraine after mobilization. It was calculated he had about 1,200 tanks around Ukraine. At least 500 have been destroyed. This is confirmed from photographs. That's 40% of his tanks. And my generals tell me that if you destroy 10-15% of an attacking column, the rest of the crews don't want to go on. And the same goes for helicopter and jet pilots. And so I think the Russian problems with morale will persist, and Putin might not be able to deliver that kind of punch that break the back of Ukrainian resistance. The geopolitical context is fascinating. I agree with Angela. The Chinese must have given him an amber light, but that's because he assured them that it would be quick and successful. And he was just told, don't wreck our Olympics, which delayed him by a couple of weeks. And I think those 2 weeks were crucial, actually, because of the terrain, the topography, the state of the frozen ground in Ukraine, and so on. But there's a new angle developing. If Finland and Sweden really apply to NATO, to join NATO, then potentially Putin, instead of having guarantees never to have Ukrainian, will have two militarily capable nations whose membership will lengthen Russia's perimeter. I mean, the border with Finland is huge. It's over 1,000 kilometers. And I feel that there is room to play here with Putin. There are very little chips that we have that would persuade Putin to withdraw from Ukraine, but this is possibly one of them. Angela already said about oil and gas. On this, it's difficult. You know, Poland is as much dependent on oil and gas as Germany. And, you know, we want the sanctions to hurt Putin rather than to hurt ourselves more. So this cannot be done from one day to the next. And I think the European Commission's plan for doing it quite quickly, 2/3 cut of the consumption of Russian oil and gas by the end of the year is pretty drastic. The question in my mind is whether the announced German shift in its defense policy and its orientation towards Russia is for real, or was it just a surprise announcement by Chancellor Scholz? The public humiliation of the president of Germany by President Zelensky would suggest to me that Ukraine is not getting from Germany what was announced, because otherwise they wouldn't dare do it. And so the question is still in my mind, to what extent Germany is really on board, and to what extent Germany will understand that its rearmament should be put in a European decision-making context so that its neighbors don't get worried about Germany 5 or 10 years down the line. And just last point, yes, I was surprised by India, and yes, countries will spread their bets on Russia, but the vote in the General Assembly of the UN was pretty overwhelming. So countries condemn Russia, but don't want to break off relations. And some, of course, will want to benefit from, say, the closure of the EU to Russian stolen assets and to the kind of tolerance for tax havens and for stolen money. And of course, other financial centers will want to benefit from that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. As you see, we already covered a lot of territory. Let me ask a question to both of you, and this is going to be a historical question. So, what have we missed in thinking about the relationship between Russia and the West after 1991? Why didn't we take Russia's irredentism and imperial nostalgia seriously? Why did we dismiss Putin's publicly expressed objectives and threats? Why we didn't impose sufficient sanctions on Russia after the previous military aggression? So what went wrong in the way in which we were thinking about how dangerous Russian policies can be, both in Washington and in Europe, and you have been in both places very close to the policymaking process?
George, this is a great question, but not to Angela and me. I think that both of us were pretty clear about Putin's direction of travel. But of course, there was resistance. You know, I was working my guts out to persuade Europeans to impose sanctions already in 2013, when the Russians started boycotting Ukrainian goods because Ukraine wanted to have a free trade area with the EU. That was the moment to show Putin that we are determined. But yes, there was that struggle of historical parallels. I have a correspondence with Frank-Walter Steinmeier, in which his position is we mustn't repeat 1914. We mustn't overreact and cause a war by accident. And I was arguing that we mustn't repeat the 1930s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I would say, who's the we? I would say the nearer you are to Russia, the more people looked at Putin very suspiciously and understood who he was. And that goes for the Baltic states, it goes for Poland, it goes for some of the other countries that used to be, well, maybe initially Orban, but not now, but used to be part of the Soviet bloc. I mean, they understood more what was going on. I think the difference was that in Western Europe, and particularly Germany, and we just mentioned President Steinmeier, I mean, the Germans really were so invested, in gratitude towards Russia for allowing German unification, in guilt for what happened to Russia in World War II. And it took the Germans a long time to say, well, admit that actually what they did to the Ukrainians was pretty terrible too when the Nazis invaded. But that was the theme. And then they had, a very profitable trading relationship and the gas trade, this whole idea of Wandel durch Handel, that, the more you trade, the better your relations would be. And the Germans have only really renounced that kind of an Ostpolitik view on February the 27th with Chancellor Scholz's speech. And I agree with Radek. I mean, it's not clear exactly how much of a turn there's really been in German policy, but at least it's rhetorically there. And then I think in the US, there was also, every US administration coming in and thinking that it could produce, could have a better relationship with Russia. And even, at the beginning when Putin was there and George W. Bush came in, after 9/11 and the sort of cooperation over Afghanistan. I mean, then people began to realize as time went on exactly who Putin was. But I think it was partly wishful thinking on the part of the West. And then I think just a failure to understand how that system worked. And again, the closer you live to Russia, maybe the better you understand that.
If I may ask, let us also not get ahistorical about this. I don't think this was inevitable. Putin did invest significant political capital in, until a certain moment, in trying to get on a Western trajectory. He came to Gdańsk in 2008 to acknowledge that that's where the Second World War started. In his terms, that was actually a sign of friendship. He was the first leader of Russia on the 7th of April 2010 to visit Katyn. He did for a while try to make it up with Poland. And I think what finally bounced him into utter opposition to the West was the protests in 2011 against his reassumption of the presidency, which he blamed on Clinton, on the United States, and on the West. He got a real scare then and decided, no, I need a pole of integration around Russia, and I'll do it against the West.
So are you suggesting that against the sort of prevailing view that it was a NATO expansion and Western policies which pushed Putin, to make this sort of decisions, you are suggesting that this is more about the internal political issues?
I completely reject that hypothesis. Because, first of all, look, they no longer talk about NATO. Second, I was at the NATO summit in 2008 when we didn't grant Ukraine membership action plan. And let's remember what Scholz said in Moscow before the war. He said, Ukraine is not going to be admitted under my watch. and Scholz might be chancellor for 10 or 15 years. So Putin got a moratorium of around a decade on Ukraine even applying. So I don't accept the argument that you have to start a war on the hypothetical possibility that someone might apply to join an alliance a decade hence. That just doesn't make sense to me.
I would also say that, you know, Putin's disillusion or anger at the West, you can also go back not only to the Iraq War and the idea of regime change, but the you know, the Rose Revolution and then the Orange Revolution. I mean, again, those were seen
and the Arab Spring.
And the Arab Spring, all of those were seen as very threatening, you know, to Putin himself. The idea of regime change, particularly in his backyard. So, you know, once he made the speech in Munich in 2007, he has already, in many ways, decided to break with the West, even though obviously there were other moments when it appeared that he might be more flexible. But definitely 2011, you know, clinched that for him.
We have a question from Peter Hall, which sort of shifts attention to what we can expect in coming months or years. So Peter asked, what does the end game look like? How much Ukrainian territory must Ukraine lose for Putin to settle? And can Ukraine tolerate that?
To whom is this question?
Well, to both of you, probably.
Then let me answer in two parts. First of all, I really think that there's something not right about publicly discussing what Ukraine should give up in order for us to have peace. Because remember what this means for the Ukrainians. I mean, Putin's language is exterminatory. He will be getting rid of Ukrainian elites in the territories that he occupies, and he will be de-Ukrainizing those territories. This is not going to be just 19th century style Russification. This, I think, will be more like Soviet style purges and mass terror. And, you know, this is Ukrainian land. They will have to live with the consequences of such decisions. And I think publicly telling them, you know, make a deal, let your citizens suffer that fate is ethically not right. And secondly, I don't think a deal is possible. I think it's very difficult for a democracy like Ukraine to give up territory. Because Zelensky, at the moment, he's very popular, but he does have political rivals. And they will scream treason and bloody murder if he agrees to anything. So I think the most likely scenario is a stalemate at the point where the armies get exhausted.
Angela?
I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think, you know, what Zelensky has so far said when they started negotiations, you know, the issue of Ukrainian neutrality there, they're willing to discuss that with Russia, but they want security guarantees. And that opens up a whole kind of question about what kind of security guarantees the West could give Ukraine, and would they be credible given everything that's happening. But, you know, if he were to say, okay, well, I'm going to accept that now Crimea and the Donbass belong to Russia and we can stop fighting. And of course, what you see now, Russia having cut off Odessa, for instance, I mean, what the Russians are trying to do is to essentially make Ukraine a landlocked country, to cut off their access to the Black Sea. I mean, if any kind of a deal like that were made, Zelensky wouldn't survive in power. I mean, that's why he said that any agreement would be subject to a referendum. So it's very hard to see an end game at the moment in which Ukraine, you know, retains enough of its own territorial integrity and sovereignty to survive as an independent state.
I think Odessa is now safe after if this was an attack on the cruiser, then the Russians can no longer do a seaborne assault on Odessa, and the landward assault has already failed, and that's important.
Okay, so that suggests that we are here for a long time, right? With the stalemate, both militarily and politically. Now, is the West, I think the European Union and the US, ready to stick with Ukraine for years to come? Do you think that this coalition, which West so quickly built, as Angela mentioned, is going to survive, for another year, 2, 3, or 4? Angela, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think it's, as I said in my opening remark, it's going to be very difficult because the economic impact of the sanctions that we've imposed, it's going to get worse over the next year. We see supply chain problems as well as inflation and all of the other things. And then you do have countries, like Hungary, who already, are not allowing military material to fly over Hungarian territory to Ukraine. And if Marine Le Pen were to win the French presidential election, then of course Western unity, I think, would be gone, because clearly what she would do is take France in a very different direction. So some of it has to do with, what's happening in different European countries, and then it's the populations and how they're going to react to all the deprivations they're feeling from the sanctions. I think it's true that as all of these atrocities are discovered, it has strengthened in some ways that unity. But on the other hand, as time goes on and more of these things appear on people's screens, they may get desensitized to this too. So I think it's going to be hard to maintain this, say for another year.
Mm-hmm. If you think that Republicans will win the midterm elections, in big way, does it going to create any problem for that unity vis-a-vis Russia?
So far, most of the Republicans in the US Congress have supported all these measures against Russia. I mean, there are some of them who are outliers, the fanatical supporters of Trump, but most of them have. Now, if new Republicans are elected, and most of those will presumably also be people who somehow have Trump's support, as we understand now, that could also shift the balance in the Congress, in the Senate. But at the moment, it looks like there is unity on the sanctions.
Mm-hmm. Radek, what's the view from Europe on this?
Well, Hungary's behavior is actually a ray of hope. We have a principle at the Polish Foreign Ministry: don't worry about Hungary; they always back the losing side. And as regards the outcome of the war, there are two questions in my mind. Wars are not really won by tactical engagements. Wars are won by outproducing the other side. And Ukraine has Western Europe behind it. And so if we continue to supply them, and it's going to be expensive, then the question is, who will crack first? The Ukraine with the power of the West and the intelligence and the technology behind it, or Russia? And of course, Putin may count on the famous forbearance of the Russians in the face of depravity, of deprivation. But there is a difference here. The people of Russia don't seem to be treating this as an existential struggle, but rather as Putin's war. And if you look at attempts to recruit volunteers, they've abysmally failed. So it would be one thing to fight Napoleon or Hitler, who's trying to conquer Russia, but quite another to take 30% per capita GDP hit for the sake of the kleptocracy. I think Putin may still have more surprises for himself in store.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Stanislav Stanskish about civil society and democratic diaspora, Russian democratic diaspora. How can they respond to the war, and whether they may have any impact on the situation in Russia in dissuading Putin from from continuing the war. Do you have any thoughts on that? Is the internal solution one of those possibilities of ending the war?
Well, obviously, there's a large and growing by the day diaspora of Russians who oppose the war. It's what I think more than 200,000 people have left since the war began. They've grouped, you have Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Sergei Guriev, and people like that who formed an anti-war committee, and they're actively communicating with each other, and they would like to reach people within Russia. But it's hard to see how this particular diaspora now could impact what's happening domestically in Russia. I mean, you still have people in Russia who oppose the war and have chosen not to emigrate for various reasons, but they understand the limits of what they themselves can do. And you have the vast majority of Russians, even if you don't believe all of the numbers in the Levada polls, and they are an independent organization, I think a majority of the Russians do still support this war, partly because the propaganda tells them, that this is a war against Nazis and against genocide against Russians, and we have to denazify Ukraine. But I think also partly because this is being presented as yet another glorious moment where Russia is being threatened by the West and where Russia is prevailing. In other words, I think if some of these people knew more of what was really happening, I don't know how much that would change their minds. And we know that when Russians or Ukrainians who have relatives in Russia talk to them, show them pictures on their phones about what's happening, the Russians don't believe them, which is by way of saying we're back to, it's a historical divide that we've seen over centuries, where you have the enlightened, more reform-minded, more westernized intelligentsia, which often then has to leave in order to survive. And the people who remain are the ones who, support the system as it is. And the two of them don't really communicate that much. So I don't know how much this latest wave of democratic diaspora can impact what's happening in Russia.
Mm-hmm. And
I think every voice against the war from people inside Russia should count tenfold, because for everybody who dares to say it, there must be other people who think it, but are just afraid. Russia is now a serious dictatorship, has more political prisoners than under late Brezhnev. And when people like Kara-Murza or others go back to Russia and try to do something about the war, that's heroism, really. And yet they do, thousands of academics. I'm told the chairman of the Union of Russian War Heroes wrote a personal letter to Putin protesting the war even before it broke out. And there will be more of it. These, if the Ukrainians are anywhere near right that they've killed 20,000 Russian soldiers, which is to say almost double the losses in Afghanistan over a decade, then those Russian mothers will soon be asking, when is my son coming from the exercise? And it'll be difficult to hide it. And there is a tradition in Russia, you don't mess with the mothers of soldiers. Mm-hmm. So this could still go very wrong for Putin. I think the chances for a coup are not high, but an Indira Gandhi type of solution, a bodyguard with a granny in Mariupol, you never know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We have question from Karl Kaiser. I guess that should go to Radek. Should the EU not make more meaningful gesture of more than welcoming Ukrainian membership and promise of accelerated accession?
The Versailles summit was a disappointment, but the president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has corrected it. She went to Kiev a few days ago, and gave Zelensky the questionnaire that you have to fill out in order to become a candidate country. So the view is that if the Ukrainians correctly fill out the questionnaire, then maybe at the next council in May or June, they will actually get the status.
And we have a question from John Torpy about China. Is China's role in bringing this disastrous war to an end? Is that an option you think we may exercise?
Well, you know, Graham Allison and a colleague of his published an op-ed, I think, in the Wall Street Journal last week, saying that China could play this role as a mediator. I mean, in theory, China could, but I see very little evidence that China has any interest in doing this. The Chinese so far have completely supported all of the Russian propaganda lines about what's happening in Ukraine. They haven't pushed back against anything. At the beginning, they talked about, well, they respect territorial integrity and sovereignty, and that includes Ukraine too. But we haven't heard too much about that since then. And just again yesterday, one of the officials said that you know, they supported essentially what Russia was doing. So it's very hard to see China playing this role. I don't know what would be in it, frankly, for China, although maybe it would get some more praise from the West, and that could impact on the relationship. But I think Xi Jinping understands that he needs Russia and Putin at the moment, you know, as an authoritarian partner against the Western dominated world that both of them criticize so much. And that, you know, and he doesn't want to jeopardize at the moment. So I find it hard to see China playing a role like that.
Radek?
My friend and mentor Zbigniew Brzezinski used to say that the choice for Russia is to be either an ally of the West or a vassal of China. And I think Putin has just made the choice. It's, in my view, the wrong choice. But if anybody is winning this war, China is. Because China is getting herself a vassal on the cheap. What's not to like?
There is a number of countries which offered services to negotiate some sort of solution. Turkey, for one, and Israel. Do you see a country which can step in and be effective in trying to somehow push the parties into some sort of serious negotiations? Angela?
Well, I mean, so Turkey obviously has provided a venue for these talks. Erdogan does have, you know, a reasonable relationship with Putin, although it's complicated, and a reasonable relationship with the West, and you know, and good relations with Ukraine, because Erdogan has backed the Ukrainians on Crimea since the beginning. But I don't think he has the kind of clout or really personal dynamics with Putin that Turkey can't offer very much more than providing a venue, which is important. And I think the same is true with Israel. I mean, yes, Israel has, you know, reasonable relations with Russia, reasonable relations with Ukraine, and good relations with much of the West. But I don't think it has the heft to really make a difference in these negotiations. I mean, they will only succeed once Putin decides that he wants something to come out of them. And for that, I don't think he needs an intermediary.
Radek?
Think of it as a really bad divorce between Russia and Ukraine. And what you want is not a shouting match, but you want to refer it to really good lawyers on both sides who can set the terms. And I think those lawyers will be found. The Swiss, for example, are very experienced in such matters. When one of the sides decides that they want to have a orderly process. I don't think Putin is at that point yet. He would have to lose the offensive in Donbass, then perhaps. But you know, if the two sides want a deal, and I think they've already agreed some parameters, there will be no shortage of intermediaries. There's in fact a whole palette to choose from.
There is this serious debate about the Endgame, posing two possible solutions. The very quick peace, where things are returning to normal, the Russian troops withdraw from parts of Ukraine, and the sanctions are lifted immediately, and so on. And that war is people who think that Russia should pay reparation for many years to come to rebuild Ukraine, that sanctions should be in place for many years to come, as long as Russia will be paying those reparations and so on. Do you think that that this kind of long-term scenario is likely? Is it possible to force Russia to rebuild Ukraine after the war? Angela?
Well, one way of doing this is, the West, collective West now has impounded a lot of Russian assets. And so the discussion is already there. Before returning any of these to Russia, you take money from those assets to help pay for Ukrainian reconstruction. Obviously, voluntarily, it's impossible to imagine at the moment that Russia would put any money into this, but there are going to be ways of using Russian assets to help in this effort. But it will be incredibly costly, obviously, to reconstruct Ukraine, billions and billions. I think Treasury Secretary Yellen was talking about that yesterday. So yes, the collective West will have to do it, but they can use some of this Russian money too.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. I think the Russian central bank reserves will be tied up in litigation for years, just like the Afghan ones are. But what worries me most is that whereas it might be in Russia's interest to make a deal and come from under sanctions and to have a new start, I don't think this is in Putin's interest. I fear that he may think a bad war, but with all the power that implies in central authority, is for him better than a bad peace, which can actually threaten him personally.
Mm-hmm. We have a question about impact of the war on other parts of Europe, especially on the Balkans and on Serbia. Do you see any specific impact on the Balkans coming from this conflict? And of course, thinking about change of EU policies vis-a-vis.
Well, there is this weird story about Chinese weapons coming into Serbia. I would like to know where they end up. And of course, Belgrade is one of the few places in Europe where there have been pro-Russian demonstrations, the other being Germany and Cyprus. And if you want to become an EU member, one of the main requirements is that you synchronize your foreign policy with the rest of the EU. And this is being noticed. There were doubts before about Serbia's orientation, and even more questions will be asked. War forces you to make choices.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would just, we've seen, again, these pro-Russian demonstrations in Serbia. We know that in the past few years, Russia has become increasingly active, in that part of the world. Also with, Bosnia being in a rather shaky situation, the Bosnian Serbs. So, if Russia does better in this conflict, then that might increase its determination to exercise influence over these countries and make sure that they, for instance, don't join the EU. But I think that's a big if at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but our worry and interest is the opposite. Namely, do we want a couple more small Russias at the table with the veto power?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Now, Peter Hall reminded us that there is, of course, a huge question of the refugees from Ukraine. Radek, do you think that this is going to have an impact on the internal EU calculations and policies? Is it going to, help the far right in various countries if we have, 3-4 million Ukrainian refugees in Europe?
I don't think so. First of all, because it is crystal clear that they are genuine refugees, 93% of the refugees in Poland are women and children. The men have actually left Polish building sites and have gone back to Ukraine to fight, which, I mean, there's a feeling here that they're fighting our fight, and that the least we can do for them is to protect their women and children. So there's a very different feeling towards them by comparison with what was happening on the Belarus-Polish border with people from the Middle East, some of whom were refugees and some were migrants. There's something else going on, namely we have this aging, aspiring autocrat called Kaczynski here, who says, no, we don't want EU money to help us with refugees. So there is a few billion euros for the taking that Poland is not applying to draw on, which is weird because we now have 2.7 million extra people, everywhere. And Polish schools or hospitals have not been keeping 15% reserve beds and seats on the off chance that we might have the largest movement of people since the Second World War. We've taken the Ukrainians into our homes as an emergency measure, but very soon they need housing, they are traumatized, they need education, they need health services, and so on. This costs a lot of money.
But isn't that consistent that that what Kaczynski has in mind is that we don't want any help from Europe because if the next wave of refugees will be from an Islamic context, then they will ask us for having them in our territories, and this is something which we don't want to do, right?
Well, it's true that Kaczynski didn't show solidarity with the south of the European Union when the wave from the Middle East hit the south. So perhaps he feels that he needs to be consistent and nationalistic about this. But this is nuts because Europe wants to help Poland deal with its problem, and it's not entirely rational.
Mm-hmm. And is the US ready to bring some of those Ukrainian refugees? I've read the stories about how complicated the process is and then how many years this is going to take for at least some of them to land up in the US.
Well, the Biden administration has announced that we will take a number. I mean, I've forgotten the exact number, but it's a decent.
I think I saw the figure of 100,000.
Yeah, 100,000. So a decent number of Ukrainian refugees, and they'll have a special path. In other words, there'll be some special regime for them, and they can stay for a certain amount of time here. We already have Ukrainians coming across the southern border, so they've managed to make their way to Mexico, and they're now coming into the United States that way. So, but we will take them. Obviously, not nearly as many as European countries will, but there's public pressure here as well to take them.
Mm-hmm. We are slowly sort of heading to the end of our conversation. Let me bring a question from Tom Simons about the security institutions in Europe. He mentions that there were different attempts to bring Russia into various security structures, and he thinks that Radek, you were in charge of Polish diplomacy when those things were happening. So do we see the failure of security institutions in Europe today? Are they going to be changed in some significant way? Do we see the rupture with Russia staying outside of any security institutions? Is Russia going to be in at certain point? What's your thoughts about the cooperation in this dimension? Angela, what do you think about this?
So, I think that everyone understands that with the invasion of Ukraine, the post-Cold War sort of Euro-Atlantic security structures, but as we saw them, really need to be reassessed because they didn't prevent this invasion. You go back to the 1990s and say, we created a Euro-Atlantic security structure in which Russia didn't have a stake. We don't have to go back and argue about why and how that happened, but that's the reality. So in theory, when the war is over, there does have to be a rethinking of how we organize European security in such a way, or Euro-Atlantic security in such a way that this couldn't happen again. It's very hard for me to see that as long as Putin is in power in Russia, that you can get anywhere with trying to create a system in which Russia would have a stake in keeping it stable. And even after he's gone, presumably whoever takes over might not have a radically different view. That doesn't mean over the years and decades it couldn't evolve. So I think what we're going to be back to is much more going back to what it looked like during the Cold War. And we already see that. You have to have more US troops in Europe. Particularly in the frontline NATO states. NATO obviously has to beef up what it's doing and to make sure that it can, hopefully contain Russia in such a way that there won't be another attack. I know other people are talking about, we can go back to the OSCE and maybe the entire Helsinki process can be rethought. At the moment, Russia doesn't have too much good to say about the OSCE. So again, that could be an institution that could be used, but I think not as long as you have the current regime in the Kremlin.
Radek, your thoughts on this?
Russia has trampled underfoot the principle of every organization that she belongs to. The Charter of the UN, the principle of the OSCE. Russia was welcomed. We tried to integrate Russia, but it was Russia that misbehaved and got chucked out of the G8. Russian citizens were very active in using the European Court of Human Rights, which is a part of the system of the Council of Europe. But Russia passed legislation which said that she doesn't have to respect judgments that the authorities don't like. And now, of course, let's remember about the origins of OSCE and the Helsinki process. The deal was the following, that the West demanded guarantees of tolerance for dissidents, while the then East wanted the guarantees of the inviolability of borders. And it is Russia that has now broken the Soviet Union's very demands. So Russia has, I think, destroyed OSCE. I think OSCE is busted flush. Because what's the point of talking at the OSCE when you know that the other side is going to misbehave anyway? Putin lied to us over Crimea. Remember, little green man, nothing to do with me. You can buy these tanks in any shop with tanks. He was lying also to the last minute about not intending to invade Ukraine. And we can't deal with a head of state who can't, be consistent or tell the truth, because then what's the point, really? So yes, I think anything can only be agreed with a post-Putin leadership.
Yeah, just to let me make one small point, right? This is a huge difference between then and now. Soviet Union was the status quo power, and Russia is the revisionist power, right? So the game is very different today. I'm afraid that we are facing a hard stop here. Let me thank Angela Stent and Radek Sikorski for your comments and thoughts about the situation, and to let me thank also all those of you who join us, and stay tuned. There will be more things coming in coming weeks and in the fall, and let's hope that the war will stop at a certain point.